Hello, everyone, and welcome to Poetry at Tech. I hope you and yours are well and thriving wherever you are. I'm Travis Denton. Thanks for being with us this beautiful autumn evening here in Atlanta as we continue our Fall 21 season of Poetry at Tech. We're still not able to gather in the Kress Auditorium at Georgia Tech, but we're happy to gather with you in our virtual space and welcome poetry lovers from many parts of the United States and the world. Our program has been around since around the year 2000, when Henry and Margaret Bourne and Bruce McEver, believing that a world-class university like Georgia Tech deserved a world-class poetry program. So each of them, unknown to the other, made endowments that led to the creation of Poetry at Tech. And in those 20 or so years, we've brought more than 300 poets to Atlanta and held more than 100 free community poetry workshops and so much more. Tonight, we're going to continue that tradition. At Poetry at Tech, we believe in community building through the arts. Poetry specifically, in case you haven't noticed, we're quite partial to poetry. Poetry shows us what we all have in common, no matter how unalike we may seem. Poetry celebrates our differences. It makes apparent to us our shared humanness, and that's important. Our three poets tonight do just that in their work. Erika Meitner, winner of the National Jewish Book Award, Eleanor Wilner, MacArthur Genius Fellowship winner, and Frost Medal recipient from the Poetry Society of America, and Afaa Michael Weaver, winner of the Guggenheim Fellowship and Kingsley Tufts Award. But before we get going, I want to thank our partners for this event. Our partners, frankly, who have made this event possible. Let's give our heartfelt thanks to the Breman Jewish Heritage Museum and Leslie Gordon. Leslie is the executive director of the museum. And let's thank the Molly Blank Fund of the Arthur Blank Family Foundation. And of course, huge thanks to the Jewish Book Council, another one of our partners. The Jewish Book Council is a nonprofit with the mission to educate, enrich, and strengthen the community through Jewish literature. Maybe you'll take a moment, I hope you will, to check out their websites, learn more about the Breman Museum and the Jewish Book Council. After the reading, stick around for just a minute. I want to tell you about what we've got coming up at Poetry at Tech, including information on how you can be a part of our free community poetry workshops and craft talks. I'll tell you a little bit about the upcoming readings as well, so stick around. But right now, I'm going to get out of the way and hand it over to Ilya Kaminsky. Ilya. All right, stick with us, everyone. Ilya might be having a technical difficulty with the interwebs, which is very common these days. But we'll be back in just a moment, and we'll get going. All right, it looks like Ilya is coming back in right now. Welcome back,
Thank you
Ilya.
so much. Thank you. Apologies, some connection problem here. That's
That's quite all right.
really great for me to be with this poet. Are you able to hear? Yeah. Okay, good. It's as I said, it's a really honor and pleasure for me to be with these poets today. They have quite influenced my own writing, and so I would like to introduce them to you. The first poet I would like to introduce today is Erika Meitner. You might have seen in New Yorker just last week a poem of hers where she writes, "It is not yet after the pandemic, but most of us have buried in public." These lines are very much about our lives, of course, but they are also instructive, I feel, when one considers the place of a lyric poet. What does it mean to be a poet, who by definition is so private, for whom the language itself is a community of sounds, images, metaphors, line breaks? What does it mean for that person to see the world in which we all live, to step out and tell the truth about what they saw, and to set the truth to music, to make it full of vivid imagery, full of artfulness, that nevertheless bears its face in public? What does it mean to be a poet in our time, to write of the many lives of the heart, and to be true to the world in which one lives? It's an ages-old question, and it is one which I feel Erika Meitner's work answers beautifully for us. Let me share a few lines. She writes, "My heart is an Alaskan fishing village during a whaling season, which is to say that everyone is down by the diving sea. The huts and stilts are empty, and my heart is a harpoon, a home-made velveteen parka, a hood lined with wolverine. My mouth has no zipper, which helps me to remember how to say, oh, oh, I miss home. When I close my eyes, I see the F-train's twin headlights bloom into the station." This mix of the earthly, the real, and passionate soul work, that awe, is what I find most moving in her work. She is a poet unafraid to be vulnerable, and in one poem she asks and answers, a love note that falls into the wrong hands. Yes, poetry I have written. Why? Because the humanness in her work is the dirt which we formed and crushed and formed again. There is much pathos and humor and tenderness in the world of this work. In one of my favorite poems, Ideal Cities, she writes, "Ideal cities have at least one drunk lady outside the liquor store mornings who asks you to hold her cigarettes so she can lean in and touch your baby. In ideal cities, the pharmacist knows your prescriptions by heart. In ideal cities, your neighbor sells pot to the cops for a living. My neighbor gives a robber a glass of wine and a hug. In ideal city, my neighbors are multi-generational family and one guy who puts chairs on the street to save a spot for our moving truck. There is no division between poetry and the world in Erika Meitner's work. Here, poetry is the world." Erika Meitner is the winner of 2018 National Book Award for Poetry, and author of 5 books of poems, including Holy Moly Carry Me, which was a finalist for the National Book Dictator Award. Her 6th poetry collection, Useful Junk, is forthcoming from Bow Editions in 2022. Please give her a very warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Ilya. Thank you. I'm hoping everyone can hear and see me. Yes, maybe. Can everyone see me? Yeah? Okay, cool. So I'm gonna go ahead and start by thanking Ilya for that amazing introduction, and also Travis, Georgia Tech, the Breman Museum, the Jewish Book Council. I am so honored to be here reading with Eleanor and with Afaa. I'm going to go ahead and start with a pandemic poem that Ilya referenced. So this one doesn't need much intro. To gather together. It is not yet after the pandemic, but most of us have bared our faces in public. Most of us are a little haptic, though we remain somewhat wary of strangers merging in enclosures. And what does it mean to gather, to take up from a resting place? We are so tired. We are uncovered and mustering strength. Never mind my mother's post-stroke slurred speech and vertigo, her ear crystals misaligned, her neck brace. We are survivors of the panic wars. We are reaching new conclusions intuitively from inferences about hugging. My radar is broken. I'm not sure where to put all my limbs. When they're tangled with yours, it's not a problem. Your failing configurations of attention, my bad knees. To draw fabric into puckers, pleated pants, rumpled sheets, your fingers hooked in my underpants, and we bring together all the parts of ourselves to embrace, haul in our bodies, to harvest like clusters of ripened cherry tomatoes, still warm from the sun. Forget the kale, stripped bare by bright green cabbage worms congregating on thick stems. To summon everyone back to this abundant and skeletal planet after we've jettisoned the billionaires into space. We celebrate the launch with tiny coupes of champagne. To throw open the doors and host guests and board packed planes where everyone is cranked and cranky about proximity still. But look at the skyline, clutches of buildings reaching for billows of clouds. To assemble in a sequence for binding, somewhere past contact tracing. Gather is a transitive verb. So this poem, the next one I'm going to read, actually takes place on the beach in Florida. So I spent the last 4 years doing field work in Miami for a documentary poetry project on sea level rise and architecture. And so this is a poem that's kind of about the apocalypse and global warming and some other things. And there's a moment in here where I quote testimony from Holocaust survivors. And the testimony in here comes from this great 1986 film by Gabe Locke called A Bee Gesund, As Long as You're Well. And these are survivors who lived in South Beach in Miami in the 80s. It's gonna be all right, promises the sound of the tide coming in. Never mind the no swim advisory, the sidewalks and parking lots strewn with yellow and black crime scene markers on the regular, the reappearing swastikas, or the fact that a quarter of humanity will run out of water by 2030. I have been invited to the beach during the eschaton, where piles of sandbags prop up crumbling dunes, where nests of endangered loggerheads are tended to by tender volunteers, where a notice posted on the public boardwalk says visitors are urged not to wade or engage in water recreation until the enterococcus warning is lifted. These days, I find myself Googling end times habitually, and the results mention world events and climax, but they don't mean what happens when we touch ourselves or each other, often on screen. They mean an ingathering of exiles, a time of transformation or redemption, rendering all of our own poor decisions moot. So when the beach clears out after sunset, I snap a topless selfie because this place was actually a nudist resort back in the 30s. I stay alert to wonders and signs. When I was running last week, a black snake at least 4 feet long slithered off the road into the dusk, and then a double rainbow so bright vaulted across the sky, I didn't know what to do except attempt to capture both with my phone. In case, covenant. In case, end of an epic. We try to warn ourselves every chance we get about this dangerous moment, but I was raised by refugees trained in the art of hypervigilance. You don't need to tell me anything. On a wall at the local museum, there's a movie rolling of Holocaust survivors filmed 36 years ago. The last Yiddish generation sunning themselves on South Beach. They say, "Don't be afraid. If we don't say anything, no one will ever know what happened." I was 24 months in the bushes, in hiding. I was laying 3 days among the dead in the wagons. We walked around like our own shadows. When I came over, I didn't have nothing. Here I'm alive, and I love it. They are singing, talking, sewing, playing cards, doing aerobics on the beach, arguing and feeding pigeons crumbs of bread, reading or napping on park benches, dancing with each other on hotel porches. The women often in pairs. Everything blows through, even the lightning breaking open thick clouds on the horizon. If I were to describe the waves here to a landlocked friend or lover, I'd say they're a roar or a shush or a breath. I am alive. There is nothing I can say to comfort us. So this is the next poem I'm going to read is actually a political poem. My congressman is not my favorite person. And for a while, we were having mass protests outside his office. This was pre-pandemic. So this poem is about one of those protests. And I think it might be helpful to know a little bit about my family history for this poem. So I am the daughter of a refugee and an immigrant. My mother was born in displaced persons camp after my grandparents were liberated from Auschwitz. My grandparents survived 5 concentration camps between them. And so this poem takes place at an immigration protest outside Congressman Morgan Griffith's office, District 9, Virginia. And I think the only other thing you might need to know about this is it's about these Melissa and Doug puzzles. It starts off with one of these puzzles where it's like when the pieces come off, they make a noise. So they like moo like a cow or bleat like a sheep. Light sensitive puzzle piece. At the protest where everyone was outraged about children in cages, a guy who looked vaguely like Jesus was holding a Keep Families Together sign, and a woman who wanted to speak was holding a megaphone, then said, "I've never used one of these things. How does it work?" And her friend with the Love Thy Neighbor, No Exception sign said, "Hold it closer to your mouth." And she did. And while she was speaking, pickups drove by with enormous Trump flags. Pickups drove by blasting aggressive country, God bless the USA. And I couldn't stop looking at protest Jesus's work boots, his cut-off homemade tank top. I was holding a sign sharpied on the back of a pizza box from 4 protests ago that said "Child of a Refugee" with a red arrow pointing to me. And I stood near 3 women with small cages for rabbits, birds, gerbils, that each held dolls. One was a Cabbage Patch Kid with blonde braids, since protest as mixed media sculpture is a thing now, even in Appalachia. And there was a toddler wearing a Superman shirt, holding a rainbow Superman was a refugee poster, and his father was holding him on his shoulders. Some nights when it was late, and my sons were small and asleep in their beds, I'd turn off all the lights in the house, and suddenly the sound of a train or a cow or cricket, something moving and alive from their puzzles, would speak. When you shifted a piece off or put one back on, this inanimate thing made animate by light would utter ghost sounds. The reporter from the local paper asked me why I was there on the sidewalk. So I told her about my mother and the DP camps. I told her only a small part of the story, but she still looked shocked. To hold is to bear the weight of a person or thing, to grasp or carry or support with our arms, to embrace someone, to keep or detain someone. There's the hold of a ship or remaining secure and intact in a position, to maintain a connection until the person on the phone line is free to speak, to have in your possession the act of grasping something, a degree of power or control. The last Shoah survivors are nearly gone, so they've made holograms to tell their stories to school children and museum visitors, but it's not the same. We respond to the sound of an actual human voice attached to a body, which means when the next woman with the megaphone in an ecumenical collar starts to read the last 4 lines of Emma Lazarus's The New Colossus, there's not a dry eye on the sidewalk in front of our local congressional office. The congressman who is away. The congressman who got teary, who looked me in the eye and said that kind of persecution could only happen in Germany when I told him my family story. Refugee from Fujio, to flee or escape from this to that. Our meeting was a season before Nazis marched through Charlottesville and the rabbis pulled the Torah scrolls from the building and someone was killed and I began quizzing my sons on our full names, addresses, phone numbers. Superman, born Kal-El on the planet Krypton, was rocketed to Earth by his father, unaccompanied, alone as an infant, moments before the destruction of his planet. It was months before anger turned to panic, then to fear. And here we are, the dislodged pieces, shoulder to shoulder, light sensitive and bleeding into the deep night. So this poem is named, it's called the Bureau of Reclamation. So I'm reading a bunch of new stuff tonight. This poem is called the Bureau of Reclamation, which is actually the name of the federal agency which oversees water resources management. And it uses repetition. The Bureau of Reclamation. We, the loyal companions. We who are hyped about everything. We who cross the thresholds of accountability. Our songs of praise sound like gunshots. We, the supermarket shoppers. We, the leggings as pants wearers. We, the shade throwers, the riven in nostalgia itinerants, who avoid our mail at all costs, who remember our exes unequivocally. We, the hypervigilant. We who collect regular explanations of benefits. We who worry about food security. We, the invasive species. We who dwell mostly in the body. We who buried our long-suffering ancestors. What would you like to cup in your hands again? Water? A flame? We, the doom scrollers. We who own wildlife patrol cameras. We, the rendered who keep rendering. Louise Bourgeois once said, I can express myself only in a desperate fighting position. We who want approval or adoration. We who see photographs as contraband. The neighbor captures a bear on film ambling through his yard. He warns the rest of us by posting the video on Facebook. We who see photographs as gestures. We the night texters. We who see photographs as certificates of presence. My grandmother received reparations from the German government. This was for performing slave labor during the war. We who believe God is not a consuming fire. Blessed is the spectrum. I am paying attention. We the delicate or empty. We the toughened and leathery. We who are bound with floss to anything proximate. We the fruit skins stitched back together after they've been peeled down. We who know the difference between chemistry and alchemy. My children's expired passports. The dream about the boat. We who gather the exiles. So I'm going to close with just one more poem. And this is one from my book, Holy Moly, Carry Me, and it's a basketball poem. It's about LeBron James, sort of, and a bunch of other things. Thank you all for being such a great audience in the chat. And I think the only thing you need to know about this poem It's about the 2016 NBA championships, and it starts off at an artist colony where Stephen Dunn, who passed away fairly recently and was a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, has a small cameo. Too strong is what the announcer dubs Steph Curry's flub shot that bounces diagonally off the backboard. This is Game 7 of the NBA Finals, and Cleveland goes on to defeat the Golden State Warriors, but we don't know this yet because we're still watching the game jammed into an alcove where it's live streaming from someone's laptop onto a wall at an artist colony, since a surprising number of writers and composers and painters are basketball fans. So when the sportscaster reels out descriptions of plays, Nate the jazz critic says, someone should write a poem called Too Strong, and Stephen Dunn isn't interested, though he's sitting behind me also rooting for the Cavs, saying things like, my goodness, and he's the best closer for his size. You have to give context in your poem, mansplains Nate, who points out that Too Strong is a hypermasculine way of saying Curry basically just fucked up the shot. It's important to note here that Cleveland hasn't won a championship in any sport since 1964. That's a 52-year curse, in case you're anti-math. I am well versed in the sadness of Cleveland. Skies hanging like lead most of the year, husks of buildings, smokestacks pumping raw flame over downtown. My husband grew up in the sadness of Cleveland, and we return there every Christmas to more unemployment, more foreclosure, more poverty, more shitty weather. When LeBron left Northeast Ohio, my husband actually burned his replica jersey in the yard, wouldn't mention his name for 3 long years of anger and mourning. He uses Cleveland sports teams to teach our sons about failure and perseverance, with a heavy emphasis on the failure. But here's LeBron on screen, lugging his city's championship dreams like a bag of rocks. Forget Tamir Rice, age 12, gunned down by police for being black, for playing with a toy gun in a park, left to bleed out on a sidewalk. Forget that Cleveland is the poorest city in America other than Detroit. LeBron stuffed this game with thunderous dunks, fadeaway jumpers, and block shots, towing his teammates along in his ferocious wake. And when LeBron goes down in the final minute of the game, writhes on the court in pain after landing on his wrist, we all want him to get up, even the artists rooting for Golden State. Get up, LeBron. Nothing comes easy to Cleveland. The next morning's paper sports a photo of LeBron embracing power forward Kevin Love, next to headlines about Venezuelan food riots, triple-digit temperatures in the West, vigils for victims of the Orlando massacre, and the Colorado woman who fought off a mountain lion attacking her 5-year-old son, literally reached into the animal's mouth and wrested his head from its jaws. Too strong. In the belly of fear and rust and shame, there is no such thing. To pry open something with your bare hands, look into the gaping maw of the beast that eats your sons, the lion, the bullets, the streets, racist cops, heroin, despair, whatever is most predatory, and say enough. We will triumph, motherfuckers. At the game's end, LeBron and the Cavs coach Tyronn Lue sobbed without shame. I've always been tough and never cried, Lue said. And LeBron at the post-game mic, wearing a cut-down net like a necklace, says, I came back to bring a championship to our city, to a place we've never been. We've got to get back to Cleveland. We're going home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erika, for this poem. So much humor and heartfelt outrage and passion, and all of it in music. One can always count on your work to really bring the full person in the poetry. Thank you. Are you folks able to hear me okay? Yeah, okay, wonderful. Well, let me start with a little bit of a personal story. Many years ago, I was a very young poet, much younger than some of the students in the audience today. And I was looking for poetry that could help me describe an experience of tales that my immigrant parents always told me about Jewish life and Russian Empire. One can easily see that in the art of a great painter such as Marc Chagall, but in poetry, not so much. Until finally I came across this wonderful book by Afaa Michael Weaver, a book of poems, complete book about Marc Chagall's work. It is called Stations in a Dream. And to my mind, it is still the best book in any genre about the work of Marc Chagall. Let me give you a taste. A rabbi zeigt and clutches the Torah at a drunken soldier dying near his feet, women and children holding to his eyes from poor rooftops. As the world is cut and chiseled, Rabbi prays in the center of the stage. God's prescience animates the audience of the mad. In Afaa Michael Weaver's work over many decades, we live in poetry that asks us to slow down and listen to the music of time itself, and ask what is the meaning of our species, whether it is a time period of Marc Chagall or a time period of 1990s or today. There is always attentiveness to the music of time. Listen, for example, to this quote. What names us? I ask, a man shuffling in bags, a man who knows the giant ants we have become, who knows us, but says now we have no name, but purple eyes in golden waves over the harbor, peace wrapping itself over the city's north border, where I climb back into the old way of dancing to be naked and breathless, so I can be freed from one pant song, to be freed from one pant song. That's beautiful. Even in his most private poems, you can hear that uncommon thing, the heartbreaking music of time. Listen, for instance, to this house training. Every Saturday morning, I got up before everybody else, everybody except her. She always had one eye open. With my bucket under my racks, I cleaned the kitchen and rest of the basement, scrubbing the yellow walls that are still yellow after 40 years. Scraping and rubbing, I got the black and the white kitchen floor so bright the tiles shined when I put the liquid wax. I had the bathroom looking like a picture. Mama was proud of me, and she told it with her sisters about how nice I did everything. I could cook, I could wash clothes and iron too. One day, one of Mama's sisters said, Michael sure will make some girl a mighty fine husband. Mighty fine. Only God and Mama knew the truth. Mama was preparing me to be alone. Yes, there is the sweetest thing, the sweet regret of time in his work. He teaches us how to see through time as we look forward, even as we look back. That is a masterful, masterful thing to be able to do. Afaa Michael Weaver has published 15 collections of poetry and had 2 professional theater productions. He is a recipient of Guggenheim Fellowship, of several Pushcart Prizes, NEA Fellowship, and a Kinsley Tufts Award for Excellence in Poetry. His most recent book is A Spirit Vaccine, which was published by University of Pittsburgh Press. Please give him a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Ilya. Thank you so much. Thank you, Travis, and all the sponsors, and for having me here. And it's a pleasure to read with Erika and Eleanor and this wonderful audience. My goodness, thank you all for signing in. Yeah, That was quite an introduction, Ilya. I have to live up to that now. And I'll be reading entirely from this collection. It was published in 1993, and I wrote the manuscript of the book in 1988 after I saw the retrospective of Chagall's work at the Philadelphia Museum of Art in 1985. And I'll start with a poem entitled Wounded Soldier. A delectable silence comes over the guns. Fog doubles itself above the heads of trenches, beating thin percussion when birds brave the flipping corpses and mud struggling to move back in the womb, move back in the arms of a woman inviolate. Suddenly, I want a cup of tea and cake, the tongue of a waitress I remember who smiled and took away the empty cup and the soft shudder of her breast bumping. Suddenly, I want an exit from this compartment of a train driving through my head from this dream. The rough mouths of the cannons are like hungry miners waiting to belch in the bistro, rubbing their black hands until the nails are blackened thoroughly, their faces beaten hard by the association with stone. And every muscled movement threatens violence, the violence of stone hurtling through the air. Now silent, now washed in the slicing tenor of rain, cutting the cannon's edge, like a piper with his ability to hone and wear down the power of perpetual rain to obliterate, to beat the tyranny of stone to non-being. Through my sleep come three ushers, limping along in disheveled uniforms, and one is like me, clearer as they move on, as I recognize first my face, then the scar my brother gave me as a child. My voice falls on my own deaf ears, and I know I am in the only place where voice and song must heed voice and song, where every truth must fall back on itself like a perfect epiphany dictating its own portrait to empty spaces. The train settles into its tracks, its smooth skidding of steel on steel strikingly absent, replaced by a requiem. Each of the poems takes the title of the painting that it refers to, and this was my early ekphrastic project, straight out of graduate school. The Fall of Icarus. Testing your father's craft until his ideas cracked under the weight of your impudence. You plummeted like a single feather, making lazy sways back and forth as you floated down to earth, rejected by the sun. The hecklers and mourners alike stood beneath you, their feet safely wedded to the earth, in obedience to the authority of gravity and the divine limitations of the human, safely and softly placed where you must crash and break. And in those quick moments as a feather, you realize you could not have flight alone, that you needed another host like you, all guaranteed the song the air emits when it consents to the wing, when it elects to make the body ethereal. You lapsed into your dream of a bird, and against Earth's reclamation were inviolate. The book opens with the poem, The Tree of Life. On the day we married, wholeness reigned. Music sprang from the full bud of a man like a flower flying above the synagogue. A presumptuous rooster pranced in the clouds. The tree of life arose in its perfection, as large and beckoning as the sun. Miracles worked their small fingers in our ears, tickling and becoming. Wishes we made as children turned incarnate. The fruit of the trees was succulent, not false or admonishing, and we were filled with the sudden light, like vessels crafted by nimble hands just for that second. We tasted wisdom and it has enriched us, set our hearts to bursting, set our souls to dancing on the strings that bind the dream. So this was 1988. It was 33 years ago. 33 years ago, I was 36. I'm soon to be 70 if I make it. And I was teaching poetry to kids in Newark, New Jersey for the New Jersey State Arts Council, and teaching composition at night. And living in East Orange, New Jersey, working in New York sometimes. And teaching the kids, I would take my lunch break. I had a black and white composition notebook, and I composed the manuscript of this book on my lunch break. At other times too, when I traveled into the city, I packed the notebook in my bag, and that's how I sat. And I took a catalog that I bought, a copy of the catalog from the show, to refer to the paintings. And one last thing about my ekphrastic method: I'm colorblind, so I have to pay attention to composition. And so you may not see too much mention of color in a book about the work of a man who did a lot with color. But that's my limitation. Lovers with Flowers, 19, page 19. Lovers with Flowers. Can you contain my most intimate whisper, settle it down after it has entered you, make it a part of you, and still cling to my hand as gently as your eyes hold me? Something must protect our weakness, our mortality, and I choose the petal and the leaf for their own transience, as life is emboldened by mortal fear. In this light through this glass and wood, I sleep confidently in your murmurs and dreams, deaf to significance, delighting in our petty island of flowers and silences. You have turned my soul to blazing pith. I've often thought about the story of King David, as a lesson for people who are pushed into positions they're not prepared to occupy and rambling around for how to perform in those spaces. The first poem is entitled Bathsheba. Not even white dresses, fresh blossoms, or the despairing angels hovering could change the fire that seized you the night after she was through her period and her womb lay open and fertile, beckoning you, arousing you, leading like a siren. Not all the concubines combined could deter the beckoning of history. Not even the memory of how Michal saved your life could break the trance of Bathsheba as you saw her bathing in a loud lust to set your breath and soul on fire, until there could be no euphony but your body with hers, emitting the percussion and wail of passion, until you could have her beneath you, her eyes widened and brightened by your driving sin. And when death seemed the answer, you dispatched it with all the authority of God's king, all the madness and delirium of greed and guilt. You chose your love from forbidden quarters, and Solomon's soul sang in the marrow of your bones. David. In your old age you adored the lyre. All the women and all the births were one wavering image. Your trembling body kept warm by a beautiful girl you could only turn your eyes to and smile, caressed with the weak hands of a father. A boy's ambitions can end in dreaming, or they can be applauded by God and given the power of metamorphosis, changing like the angelic host from wisp and mist to flesh, blood, stone, wood, and fire to livestock. You looked at Abishag, at her unblemished figure, the soft call of her curling lips, the dark hair falling on your shoulder as she massaged your rigid neck and rubbed her thighs against yours to keep the king immortal. But desire was gone. You remembered the countless marriages, the children, wondered without love, how could you have dreamed? So my wife and I have just finished the Intro to Judaism course because we're exploring Reform Judaism. My wife is the daughter of a matrilineal heritage. Ashkenazi Jews, her mother's family came here from southern Russia in the early part of the 20th century. And so I'm learning more than what I knew when I wrote this book. I just wanted to say that. This poem is entitled The Praying Jew. 7 severe indications of my love for you were in the wall, flaming like the aura around the temple at Sinai, speaking in voices ranging to the imperceptible, the invisible soprano of hosannas, of manna falling like walls of rain at night, and I awoke grasping for your embrace. Walk with me past the dropping of the moon, to where we inhabit the ocean, and our sojourn is through the cold timber of my heart, to its center, where you can kiss it and set the world to beginning, to creating and recreating itself infinitely, to its center where I will vanish with you. Hear my soul singing to you, shouting to me, shimmering like the blinding vision of Ezekiel, streaming down like the oral Torah, from your tongue to the earth, to hearing, hear my soul reaching back to the full cloth of your breath that rendered it to me. Hear my prayer of desire for divine love. As the Shema says in Deuteronomy 6, love the Lord with all your heart and soul and strength, which is the reference there. The poet reclining. I can never convince my father that my best work is done in naps, in the greenness of grass, near the smell of manure, of the song of neighing and snorting, and the infinite music that fills the word with bright meaning. After I am half out of life, I can have discourse with the trees, with each leaf that tickles itself and flirts with the branch, sending me the secrets of a woman, of the distinguishing flurry of her smile. In this grass, I always dream that if I stay a little longer, I will leave this skin, skull, heart, brain, femur, and blood, and melt into the soil and multiply like the infinite bees of this planet, becoming the thing I spend my life singing to. But I cannot convince my father, who uses manure tearfully for flowers, hoping to raise my mother from her birth in the earth. And just one last poem on self-portrait, but I also just want to say something about the process of writing to visual art, to painting, for me that is. It's pretty easy for me to establish some kind of conversation between myself and the piece of work I'm looking at, that I'm regarding or studying. But I don't always understand where that conversation comes from. And I read these poems sometimes and I still wonder where this came from. It's a kind of mystery. And the title of this painting, again, the title of the poem, is Self-Portrait. I see myself in the shadows of a leaf, compressed to the green blades growing to a point like the shards of miles of mirrors falling and cracking to perfect gardens. I never inspect the withered assumption of my face's petty dialogue and raindrops, the deceptive spreading of the words oozing from the skin to the edges of water etched on the ground by gravity and wishing. Passing for the seriousness of my eye, platitudes of my white collar, the perfect posture of my lips. It skirts from the leaves of the plant hiding me and sits stoic like stone in my pupil, mute and unassuming like Rashi. To gather myself, I will swim naked in the wind, bending my blind elbows in circles, stopping now to dance like the cherubic gold on the ark, and gather myself from the particles of this excitement, another structure, one closely resembling the beginning. I did say it was the last poem, but I do want to do just one more, back to the beginning of the book, to Adam and Eve. And we were in Torah study a couple of weeks ago, and we were, turning a humorous tone there, discussing the beginning of the Torah. And one person said, well, there were only 4 people on earth. What did you expect? So it's one of the things I love about studying the Torah, the sense of humor. Adam and Eve. The serpent had an agent, a tiny stag with a bird perched on antlers that shone like silver, suggesting flight to Eve, soaring above the tree with his blue leaves, going into the giant base of God. Adam was proud of his wife and the tree, admiring the gesticulating trunk, laughing at the snake's ludicrous dancing like a drunken emperor. Before the fruit, they held knowledge suspect, but had no warning of the truth, of life's prescience and power to transform. Eve wept at the beauty of the faces and shadows. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Afaa, for this beautiful musical reading. I love the music of your voice, and listening to you here, it's really such a privilege. Thank you so much. When I'm asked you to speak about Eleanor Wilner's poems, and if I'm asked you to give just one statement on her work, my response usually is Eleanor Wilner's poetry shows us that we are still living in biblical times. What does that mean? She's a poet interested in making out of our moment a myth. But how does she do it? She looks at detail of a moment and sees something larger. Let me give you an example. In Jewish cemetery in Prague, the ghetto was small, so little space for the living, and less, by rights, for the dead. The bodies were buried standing up, the underground train to Sheol packed for the rush hour of ghosts. When the train arrives, when the final tram sounds, the saved dead rise with a sign. They will, at last, lie down. I love how, despite the horrors of history, the poet is revising the myth and gives it tenderness, the last word. They will, she says, at last, lie down. That's what the art can do. And Wilner also gives us beautiful poems about the purpose of art itself in our lives. In fact, I can honestly tell you that there are very few living poets from whom I have learned about the meaning of art, its moral dimension. Here is a quote. Prometheus, who stole the god's fire and gave it away, as art gives the power to give it away. For that fire is the gift that cannot be held, for it will burn as ash those born again, world without end. Who would hold it? I say she is the poet from whose work I learn, from whose words others I know learn. How exactly does this learning happen? Here is another example. I just read you a few lines about Prometheus and the meaning of art. These lines use the image of fire. Now, watch how this image of fire reappears in her work elsewhere, in very different poems. It's really quite amazing, a lesson in poetics, in how one poet builds a vision over many years to watch just one word reappear from poem to poem in books. Forgive me, for I am about to share a lengthier quote, but it is really worth it, as it gives you the perspective on just how large Eleanor Wilner's vision is. 2 apes caught in the act of coupling made a mutant child, who woke to sunlight wondering his mother torn by the huge new head, thus forced the narrow birch canal. as if compelled to repetition, and to unlearn again. White fire at the heart of matter, fire we sought, and fire we spoke. Our thoughts, however elegant, were afire from first to last, like sentries that watch to Argus as a signal fire passed the peak to peak from Troy to Nagasaki, triumphant echo of the burning city walls, and prologue to the murders yet to come. We scanned the sky for that bright flash. Our eyes stared wide from watching for the signal fire that ends the epic accursed line with its caesura, a pause to signal peace, or a rehearsal for the silence. This frankly is stunning. The uncompromising honesty in how she sees our species over many different historical events and how she connects it by just one word that burns to the end. What I learned from this personally as a practicing writer is that Eleanor Wilner doesn't just document the facts of our time. She makes a lasting myth out of these facts. And that, my friends, is true art. Eleanor Wilner is the author of Before Our Eyes, New and Selected Poems, published by Princeton University Press, which includes poems from her previous 7 books of poetry. She received a Frost Medal for Distinguished Lifetime Achievement from Poetry Society of America. Other awards of hers include MacArthur Foundation Genius Fellowship and several Pushcart Prizes. Please give her a very warm welcome.
Don't seem to be on camera.
We can see you, Eleanor. We can see you.
You can see me?
Yes,
Okay.
we can.
Because I have a blank screen here. Okay. Ilya, it's very difficult to follow an introduction by you. Thank you for that. And it's such a joy and a privilege tonight to read with Afaa and Erika. Thank you all for listening. So let's begin where we are. You're sure that there is a video here, yes? Okay. I'm kind of privileged to look at a blank screen instead of my aging face. So it is here, then, after so long and after all, as the light turns in the leaves in the old golden way of fall, as the small beasts dig to the place at the roots where survival waits, cowardly crouching in the dark. As the branches begin to stretch into winter, freed of their cheerful burden of green, then it comes home, the flea-ridden bitch of desolation, a thin dog with its ribs exposed like a lesson in mathematics, in subtraction. It comes home to find its bowl empty. Then the numberless things for which to be grateful dissolve, like the steam from a fire just doused with water on a day of overcast grays, lined by a cold slanting rain. It is October, that season when death goes public, costumed, when the talking heads on the TV screen float up smiling at the terrible news, their skin alight with the same strange glow fish give off when they have been dead a week or more. As the gas company adds odor for warning, that the lines may be leaking the sweet smell of disaster hanging invisible in the air. A moment before you strike the match. Afaa spoke about the mystery of what happens on a page for which you can't really feel responsible. This next poem is one that seemed to happen before my eyes as I wrote. I'd been haunted by an image of a girl with bees in her hair, about whom I knew nothing when I began the poem. So call her metaphor or messenger. Her figure simply materialized out of the local air. The girl with bees in her hair came in an envelope with no return address. She was small, wore a wrinkled dress of figured cotton full from neck to ankles, with a button of bone at the throat, a collar of torn lace. She was standing before a monumental house on the scale you see in certain English films, urns, curved drives, stone lions, and an entrance far too vast for any home. She was not of that place, for she had a foreign look and tangled black hair, and an icon heavy and strange dangling from an oversized chain around her neck that looked as if some tall adult had taken it from his and hung it there as a charm to keep her safe from a world of infinite harm that soon would take him far from her and leave her standing as she stood now, barefoot, gazing without expression into distance, away from the grandeur of that house, its gravel walks and sculpted gardens. She carried a basket full of flames, but whether fire or flower, with petals shading toward a central gold, was hard to say. Though certainly it burned, and the light within it had nowhere else, fed on itself, intensified its red and burning glow, the only color in the scene. The rest was done in grays, light and shadow as they played along her dress, across her face, and through her midnight hair, lively with bees. At first, they seemed just errant bits of shade until the humming grew too loud to be denied, as the bees flew in and out as if choreographed in a country dance between the fields of sun and the black tangle of her hair. Without warning, a window on one of the upper floors flew open. Wind had caught the casement. A silken length of curtain filled like a billowing sail. The bees began to stream out from her hair, straight through the single opening in the high facade. Inside, a moment later, the sound of screams. The girl, who had through all of this seemed unconcerned and blank, all at once looked up. She shook her head, her mane of hair freed of its burden of bees, and walked away out of the picture frame, far beyond the confines of the envelope that brought her image here, where the days grow longer now, the air begins to warm, dread grows to fear among us, and the bees. This next poem responds to how numbers numb us, how we are desensitized by the constant media stream of atrocities, mass shootings in America, wars, catastrophes abroad, this cascade of violence. How can we care? How, even to make it real, what can we do about what this does to us? So those are the questions that animate this poem. Its title, In a Time of War, a time which seems to have become perpetual. Flies caught in the sap of the living tree someday will be precious, dressed in amber. Just so the past appears to the present, gem-like in its perfect preservation, the hardened gold of yesterday, a relic through which today's sun shines. But those who are caught in the sticky sap of actual time, insects in the odds against them, who struggle in the ooze, slowly sink into the mass, the numberless anonymous dead, till the atrocious becomes the mundane, our senses numb from the sheer litany of repetition. Let us then just watch this one small, desperate fly, duck first by the feet, and then in its struggles entangled entirely in the glob of sap, its wings heavy as a brass angel's, until it is all at once still, a dark speck in a bubble of sap oozing from the felled tree in a forest marked for the mill. How many millennia will pass before a teardrop lavalier of amber carrying its cargo of loss will adorn the vanity of another creature, the fly, a fossil of a species no longer present on the earth? The earth itself, a speck in a cosmos where galaxies are carded like cotton on a comb and pulled out into a distance where some new fabric is being spun and shimmers in the firelight of countless burning suns. I'd like to read you a new poem. This is one that also responds to the problem of scale. The overwhelming fact that there are now 80 million migrants, displaced people torn from their homes by wars, genocide, climate change. To confront such a magnitude of suffering needs something larger, older, more rooted than we are. And so it was that I began this poem, but the pronouns shifted and the trees. And these trees, or the speakers, have their roots in collective memory, in the biblical Psalm 137 that speaks to the recurrent human history of war and exile and forced migration. I'll quote a few lines to recall it. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song, and they that wasted us required of us mirth. Forgive my rusted voice. Time does its work on you. For the willows to bless with a shower of leaves, red in the dawn, stream by their side, river flow idling a little backspill, the shrill cry of a bird. And little by little, as the light grew, the sun crusted the hills, and as it splintered its gold among our leaves, a two-legged figure appeared. And behind it another, as if the horizon itself was an opening seam from which they were pouring, a column stretching back and back over the hills that the sun had just mounted. They were backlit by that sun, flat silhouettes, and it was hard to discern one from another. So alike they appeared, and so endless their procession. and as they approached us, we tensed, feeling something between apprehension and wonder. So much like an army of ants they seemed, so many, so many. As they came closer, we heard a great keening, so that unsure how to greet them, aware they brought with them a great grief, we offered them what we could. Shade, a cool shelter from the heat that had begun to follow the sun, a soft bed of needles from the pine to sleep on. And as we caught and played the breeze in our leaves, we sang to them, our thoughts moving in the slipstream of time's passage, wind in the harps hung in our branches, left there in despair by others so like them years ago. Slow circles of years we can barely remember. Still, the song of the wind in the harp strings has mingled and merged with our tendrils of thought. As singing we offer them now, this sorrowing multitude, who in return bring their tears to water our roots. So one last poem. Shelley famously, or perhaps fatuously, said that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. I don't think so. But what I do think is that poets are the translators of the unacknowledged world. And that world, as it becomes visible, reflects on and reveals the everyday world seen as it is so often in an unthinking daze of denial. Probably the best thing you can say about poets is that they are unpopular with fascists. One of the initiating events in the tragic Spanish Civil War that announced the rise of fascism in Europe, into which I was born, was the murder in 1936 of the great Andalusian poet Federico Garcia Lorca by the Falangistas of the dictator-to-be Franco, whose war cry was "Viva la muerte," long live death. And seldom are men so honest, their objectives. The next year in that war saw the bombing of Guernica, the first massive scale bombing of a city, I don't forget Tulsa, which would change warfare and make the majority of its victims civilians from that time on, up against it. The wall was white, whitewash line that shines in the sun till white is pure pain, searing the eyes. And the wall was marked, pocked by a spray of black holes, like nothing so much as the dots in a child's puzzle, waiting for a line to make sense of them to pull from a scatter of points, a familiar shape. At the beginning of the bad time, we have come to think of as usual. They stood a man here against this wall simply because of what he was, something that made it harder to do what they wanted. So they thought that if they killed him first, at the very beginning, the rest would come easy, his blood like a red door opening into the future, in which the gypsy wind, capricious, always eluding them, would be stilled, tied in a sack. And the everyday that wore them down into grit under its heels would disappear into clouds of power. Their boots would be real leather, the rawhide smell from what they had taken and hadn't the time to cure. And if he were Lorca, Garcia Lorca, the writer with a fire in his hands, and he was, and if they stood him up against this wall, in its white that defeated the light, throwing it back like a knife into the eyes. And if in that moment, as they raised their guns, he remembered a dream he had dreamed but a month before, a dream of a lamb surrounded and butchered by shepherds. If all this were true, and it is, then we approach this wall at our cost, counting its black holes like the shrunken emblems of the cosmos eating back its own matter. And what then? Shall we paste up the placards of a revolution in which we no longer believe? Shall we tear down the wall, knowing another stands behind it and another to the horizon of counting? Shall we line up the children beside it, pointing at each hole as a lesson through which, like a sieve, their hope will begin to drain out? Or shall we plant flowering vines along the wall to cover and gentle the record, and when each tendril, each slow waving filament, each unruly winding line of green is swaying along the wall, looking for somewhere to anchor its urge to go on growing, verde, te quiero verde. What then? Why, by then, in the long twilights, in the hard work of planting and watering, of watching and waiting, by then we may have understood what we can't now imagine, desperate as we are about the white wall, the holes in the shape of a man, the mark they wanted to leave us, the line terror taught us to trace. So different from the one that he left, the one whose shape left its trace in the heart, the balcony open, the long spill of stars in the sky, the track of creation's milky tongue. And listen, the shift and seethe of the sap, forcing its slow way toward the branching twigs, the ear-splitting crack as the end is riven by budding. A salt breeze in the orchard, the small leaves trembling with light.
Wow. Wow. That's right. Well, now let's end the way that we like to end things here at Poetry at Tech. And we like to end with gratitude. And I have to say, Eleanor, Erika, Afaa, that reading was just amazing. Thanks for bringing your generosity of spirit, all of you, into this space. And just thank you. What happened is you made me want to go right now. I just want to go right, and I'd love to feel that way after a poetry reading. So thank you all so much. And I also want to thank our partners whose support has made this reading possible. Honestly, I want to thank again the Breman Jewish Heritage Museum and Leslie Gordon. Thank you so much, and thanks to the Jewish Book Council as well. Special thanks too to Team Poetry at Tech. We have our squad out there. That's Skanda Prasad. Skanda is our technology wizard and an amazing poet himself. He's the gentleman that's pressing all the buttons behind the scenes, making this possible tonight here on Blue Jeans. So thank you, Skanda. And I'd also like to thank Kaden Poe. She is the amazing design editor at Poetry at Tech, making us look so good in print and on social media. But looking ahead, November 13th, I hope you'll join us for a manuscript workshop with Christina Marie Darling. Her workshop is Perfecting the Manuscript, Publishing the Book. Very valuable workshop, November 13th. Then on November 18th at the Atlanta International Poetry Festival, an evening of Chinese poetry and translation with Ming Di and others. And you can discover more information about that event on the Poetry at Tech website. Finally, on December 4th, we have a workshop for immigrant and refugee poets with Carolina Abid. That's December 4th. You can register for those workshops on the Poetry at Tech Poetry at Tech website. Right now. But thanks again so much for being with us tonight. Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Erika. Thank you, Afaa. And looking forward to seeing each of you again. Until then, stay safe. See you soon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, good to be with all of you. Good to see you.
Bless you, Ilya.
Thank you so